So, Kim, welcome to the Lead, Learn, Grow podcast. I've really been looking forward to this conversation and so glad to have you.
Thank you, Robin. I've really been looking forward to this too. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, for sure. Well, in our little chit chat before we hit the record button, you said, I really have a passion for this. And I'd love for you to tell the listeners, how did that passion come about?
Well, it has not been a straight path. I say all roads lead to EQ. So I have had an interesting career on the corporate side, the very entrepreneurial side, and everything in between. I feel like it's been up, down, and sideways. And I've always been interested in human interaction and reaction. It was kind of like a side project for me. I didn't know that it had a name. I didn't know that there was such a thing as EQ per se, but that's always been like through my entire career, something that has been sort of top of mind. And about, I would say like 2018, some friends of mine who own a great business called the Oval Group, they came to me and said, we're thinking about doing a live EQ conference or session. Would you be interested in working with us because you are really into this whole, mind body thing? And to back up a little bit, I am a yoga therapist in addition to all my other things that I do. And so they thought that would be really, really interesting to have a yoga therapist there with all these business people teaching them how they can help increase their EQ. And so that was something way out of left field for me. But I thought that was, really interesting. So I said, sure, let's do it. Let's try it. So we did. We had, I think, a group of about 10 to 12 people, and everybody raved about it. They loved it, including myself. I was just so intrigued. I was listening to everything Dobby and Steve were saying, and and then it was like, oh, that's right. I gotta be part of this too, because I was absorbing so much. So that's how it all started. I literally came in as the person who was teaching people how to take these ideas and find tangible enablers for them to use going forward. So we did a couple of these in person. And the more that we did these, the more I thought, this is amazing. Like, I'm really into this. And so I started researching, I started reading, I started getting much more into the back end of EQ, not just the enablers and, the tools and the tips on, what you can do to improve your EQ, but, just getting into the whole idea of EQ itself. So from that point on, I just became obsessed with it. And Dobby and Steve knew this. And then the pandemic hit, and of course we were all, stuck inside, couldn't do these live versions of these conferences or these meetings. And so they came to me and they said, our business is really growing, and they do a lot of online, so that was really helpful because they could still grow their business. We're growing our business. We're looking for a third partner. Would you be interested? So not just EQ, but other sciences as well, like DISC and driving forces, and other tools that people can use and businesses can use to make smarter decisions and better themselves and their organizations. And I said, that is amazing because I have time. I'm here. I've got time. So that's kind of how it all started. So I got certified in these sciences, started helping them with their assessment. So I would do assessment reviews, and it just started to lean a lot towards EQ, and so much so that several businesses that I worked with asked us, Davi, Steve, myself, if we did coaching, and talked about it, and we thought, well, let's try this. So I started coaching a couple people who I had worked with on EQ, and it just grew into now my business. So that's sort of a long way of saying that, I've always had this fascination, but now it's like a real thing. Now it's
Yeah.
professional.
So that's interesting. So let's go back and just start with the very basics. So most people listening to this podcast, they've heard of IQ.
Yes.
So we know what IQ is, and you're talking about EQ, emotional intelligence. And so, why should leaders, professionals, even parents for that matter, why should people care about EQ? Why is it important?
That's such a great question. EQ, people think of EQ, which we call it EQ, which doesn't sound like it makes sense, but it's emotional intelligence. They hear the word emotions, and 50% of the population gets really nervous and says, nope, I do not want to tap into my emotions. So, first off, what EQ is not, it's not therapy. A lot of people think it is, but it's not therapy. EQ, I like to call it brain retraining, because basically what you're doing is tapping into your brain and learning how to manipulate it. And I know a lot of people have heard that, now we're realizing that brains are very plastic, that you can change your brain, you can change your outcome physically and emotionally, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
So basically with emotional intelligence, you are you're really manipulating your brain. And so let's take a step back. And if you think about a time when you are relaxed, I call it vacation mode. When you're relaxed, when you don't have a lot on your mind, when you're very calm. We call that in EQ speak, we call that being in the clear or in the blue. Okay. So that's where you are, where most people want to be. But in today's world, it's kind of hard to stay there or to get there very often. Right. But that's the goal. So if we're in that state, then we're in a really good place, especially with our this little gland called the amygdala that is just below our higher cortex. The amygdala, when we're in blue or clear, it is quiet, it's small, it leaves us alone. When we get what we call triggered or hijacked or in the red, where anything happens, anything at all to change our brain, just our brain function, then our amygdala literally grows. It literally grows and it starts to release chemicals that we really don't want in excess in our body. So that's like the cortisol, the adrenaline, the norepinephrine. You don't want excess of that stuff in your body, right? So I know we're getting a little physical here, but it all goes back to wanting to stay in the blue, clear, low emotion, right? So when you're triggered and you go into high emotion or red, then you get these stress chemicals, hormones, spewing through your body, and that leads to number one, a disability to use your brain the way you want to. So you can't think as clearly as you normally would. And number two, and this is the part that a lot of people don't realize, it leads to chronic illness and disease. So if you live in a state of red or triggered, you are most likely to have some sort of serious illness by midlife or even before, right? So that's scary. That's kind of scary. So why we care is because we want to be able to stay in the blue as much as possible, right? And then emotional intelligence is really knowing how to get out of that red state, get out of that hijacked state and back to a state of blue or clear. So that's what emotional intelligence is and why we care, basically.
So you talked about retraining your brain. So what does that look like? Like what are the if I wanted to retrain my brain, what would I be doing?
So that gets into the nitty gritty of emotional intelligence. And let me just add one more thing, because this is really important as to why you want to retrain your brain. If you get hijacked and you do nothing about it, it always will take a minimum of 4 hours to naturally get back to a state that's close to clear or blue. So you're in a hijacked state for at least 4 hours. So think about, and when I talk about some of the things that hijack us, you'll realize that most of us live in a state of hijack 90% of the time. So again, think of all the chemicals, all those all those what I call can chemicals just releasing in your body throughout the day, right? We don't want that. So anyway, I digress a little bit, but going back to, I think that's important because we need to know that we don't want to be in that state. We want to get out of that state as fast as possible. We can do that with high EQ. So there are 5 dimensions in emotional intelligence. And you always want to start with awareness. So there are 2 types of awareness in emotional intelligence. We've got what we call self. So there are 3 dimensions that really focus on you, on the individual. And those are self-awareness, self-regulation, and motivation. Okay, I'll break each of those down. But those are self, they're called self because they deal with an individual being able to act and react the way they want. They can control. You and I can control the way we act and react most of the time. And so with EQ, it's helping us do that better. The last 2 dimensions are what we call others. And that is the minute that you have another human being come into the picture or a group of people, you do not have any control over how other people act or react, right? In theory, I mean, with EQ, you can have a little bit of control over both, but for the most part, you lose that control when somebody else comes into the picture, right? Mm-hmm. So the last 2 dimensions are social awareness and social regulation. So those are the 5 dimensions that make up EQ. If you go back to the starting point, we're going to start with self, with our 3 self dimensions. Everything starts with awareness. If you're not aware, you can't do anything about it, right? So self-awareness is literally knowing when you've been hijacked. That's it. People want to add all sorts of things to it, but it's literally just knowing when you've been hijacked, okay? So if somebody's yelling at you, hijacked, right? If you get cut off in traffic, you're going to be hijacked. If a fly is flying around your head in your office, hijacked. What's interesting is you can rate those according to severity, right? Intellectually, but emotionally, higher cortex sees all three of those hijacks as lions. They're all equal. Doesn't matter.
Can I ask you a question? Can I interrupt you?
Absolutely.
So triggers and, being triggered and this amygdala hijack that you speak of, can it be just being in a stressful, here's why I ask. Let me tell you what I was thinking when you were sharing that. So my wife, who is on the disc, she's an S style. So she likes calm and steady and harmony, and she doesn't really like to be out front. And she's a great team player, a great supporter, but she doesn't want to be the one with the microphone. Well, over the last few years, she has led like this neighborhood Bible study for some of her friends in the neighborhood. And it's funny, we laugh about it, but on Tuesday nights when they meet, like she wakes up on Wednesday, and this whole 4 hours thing kind of caught my ear. She wakes up on Wednesday and she's exhausted. And so can these triggers, do they have to be someone cuts me off in traffic, or can it be being in a situation that is a little more stressful than usual over a period of time? Does that even make sense?
That makes so much sense. And thank you for bringing that up, because that really does help to double clarify what I'm talking about. Yes, it's anything. So your triggers are going to be really different than your wife's triggers or my triggers. Triggers can be anything at all that take you out of blue. Anything. It doesn't matter what it is. That is such a classic example. Even if somebody's going to public speak, that we don't think of that as a negative. I mean, we can think of it as scary, but you don't think of it as negative, right? But you're still getting hijacked. You're still hijacked because your brain is thinking danger, 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 even if that doesn't make sense to us intellectually. So, absolutely, what your wife goes through is a huge trigger. It's a huge trigger. And if she regulated right after that, that meeting, she may feel differently the next morning,
So what would that look like?
possibly.
What would that
Yeah.
look like?
So,
What are some ways to, through self-awareness, to identify and then sort of get back to blue, as you say? What would be some techniques?
well, that's a perfect question because you have to, of course, you have to be aware first. And if you get cut off in traffic, if somebody's yelling at you, if a lion is chasing you, you're going to get triggered, right?
Mhm.
But if a fly's flying around or the situation, that you were mentioning with your wife, if those kind of things happen, you might not realize that you're triggered. So with self-awareness, part of it is knowing there's a physical sensation, and everybody has a physical sensation that happens to them that is theirs. So for you, can you think of what happens when you're triggered? What do you feel physically? Some people have sweaty palms. Some people have a heart racing, or like the blood rises up their head. Can you think of something that happens to you?
Yes. Yeah,
What would that be?
I feel it in my upper chest, and sometimes even like I take like a micro breath, like I almost miss a breath. Like it's not hyperventilation. I don't know what the word is, but I can feel, I can feel it like in my upper chest is where I can feel an actual physical manifestation.
So that's very self aware. That's extremely self aware. You went right to it. You knew. A lot of people I work with, they have no idea. They don't even know what I'm talking about until we explore it. And then, they finally tap in and go, oh boy, this has been here my whole life and I never realized it. So, one thing that people can do is tap into that physical reaction. And once you know what it is, if you feel that, worry about why am I hijacked or what's going on. Just know I'm hijacked. I need to regulate. So, when you feel that, Robin, don't worry about why. Right into regulation. Okay. So, that's a helpful point, I think, because because we spend so much time in trying to figure things out. So, okay, you're feeling that. So what are you going to do about it? That's the next dimension. That's self-regulation. And that is right when you know you're hijacked, taking action. And it doesn't have to be a big deal. I mean, there are a million things. And what I try to do is tailor the actions to each individual. So I put together a whole plan of regulation, that's easy and quick that people can do. But globally, I can say that the best or the tried and true self-regulation tool is regulating your breathing. So taking, some people, if they meditate or they practice yoga or they have a breath practice, what we call pranayama, then they can automatically do that. If you've never regulated your breath and really put the mind and body together, it can be a little bit daunting. But it's basically just take the deepest breaths that you can, like your life is depending on it. And that automatically de-escalates and takes you down a notch, because not only are you telling your brain by breathing and slowing everything down, there's no lion here, I'm safe, but it also oxygenates your cells. So it gives you, it kind of, it tells the amygdala, calm down, it's okay. So that's the number one. I would say for anybody who's listening today, try that. When you feel triggered, really focus on your breath. And my favorite number 6. So I take 6 really deep breaths. So
Mm.
that's one thing you can do. One other quick thing that you can do is self-talk. And that is just tell your brain, talk to your brain, which sounds ridiculous, but talk to your brain and tell your brain there's no lion here, or I'm okay, I'm safe, or if somebody's yelling at you, this is them, it's not me. Come up with your own things to tell your brain. You've got to use your own voice, but I can't tell you how powerful that is.
Yeah, and I think too, and as I told you before we started recording, I know enough about this just to be dangerous, which is not that much. But correct me anywhere I'm wrong, but our amygdala is a a great thing, right? That's the part of our brain that has kept us alive. The fight or flight center. And, as you referenced earlier, well, nowadays we don't have lions coming across the plains. We don't live in this world where we have to be always vigilant and concerned about safety. Now we have email boxes and people and things, but our brain doesn't know the difference. That prehistoric part of our makeup doesn't know the difference between a lion and a cutting comment that someone makes to us. And so it's there for a good thing. So I guess what you're saying is we just need to recognize that. And then when we feel it, immediately shift into self-regulation so that we can come back to center or come back to blue, as you said. Do I have that about right?
You nailed it. That's exactly it. Right. And so the emails and just the fast pace and the craziness of life, those are our lions. So right, we don't have actual lions, but our brain doesn't know that. Yes, the amygdala is trained to just keep us safe, and it is a great thing. But we have to know how to work with it. And if
Mhm.
you know how to work with the amygdala, then it's great, and you can live together in harmony, and everything's great. Um, but it's a conscious effort. You have to always be conscious, and so this is what's so important with the self part of emotional intelligence.
Yeah, and I go back to something you said earlier. Like many people live an entire life and never have this awareness. And that sort of low level chronic stress, like it has an impact. And so I ask you the question, why is this important? I mean, as I hear you talk about this, like it really is important that we understand that we're not anywhere close to our best if we're not able, through awareness and regulation, to understand what's happening to us. Interesting.
That's very true. And I know we're spending so much time on the self part, and I know this is a basically a leadership podcast, and we'll get to
Mhm.
that. But if you as a leader or a human being aren't, feeling your best and showing up to your best self, then it's hard to lead or it's hard to do what you want to do. So yeah, and of course, as I mentioned, you want to stay healthy. So these are things you can do that will keep your brain from going down that dark, spirally hole. So that's why it's so important.
Yeah, so let's kind of shift it into like a business setting. So s- s- I think there is research. I remember reading a book years ago by Daniel Goleman, and I think if I remember the numbers right, he looked at leaders and success of business and that sort of thing. And he found there was a stronger correlation between leaders with a high level of EQ as compared to IQ. So why is it that EQ sensitive or people that are have a high EQ, why is it that they are better in a leadership setting? What are some of those dynamics?
Yeah, so EQ is often considered a better predictor of business success than IQ, which I know is surprising to a lot of people because it directly impacts leadership, teamwork, decision making, adaptability, all critical elements of in a professional environment. So people with EQ have great people skills. They can go with the flow. They can make decisions under pressure. They're really good communicators. And if you think about it, people with IQ might have none of these, right? I'm not saying they don't, but not necessarily. People with EQ do have high EQ have these. People with high IQs don't necessarily. So you can see how that could, be a predictor of success. Now, you mentioned Daniel Goleman. He's done a lot of research, and I actually have some studies. I'm gonna just pull them over for a second here. Let's see. So Daniel Goleman's research, he said that that EQ is responsible for about 90% of the qualities that make high performers stand out from their peers.
Hmm.
90%. And so his study suggests that while IQ is important for getting a job, EQ is what determines long-term success. So that's pretty powerful, right? And there are lots of other studies. There's Harvard Business Review did a study of the 200 top global companies, and they found that the top performing leaders consistently scored high in EQ traits, and their companies outperformed competitors with lower EQ scores. So very interesting. And then one other study by Dr. Travis Bradbury and Jean Graves, who co-wrote the best-selling book Emotional Intelligence 2.0, which I highly recommend, by the way. They found that people with high EQ earn an average of $29,000 more per year than those with low EQ, and having nothing to do with IQ.
So where do you think, is there one, so there's 5 elements that make up EQ. Do you find that people struggle with one more than the other, or is it more generic than that?
It's more personal. I think it just depends on the person, and I've seen dimension skews all over the board. Uh, I would say that I see a lot of people, and this has been proven too, that a lot of people do struggle with the other part, the social awareness and social regulation parts of EQ, because that is where you have to work with other people. So whether you're a leader or whether you are being led, it's how do you show up and what do you do around other people. So social awareness is how do you read a room. It's how are you interacting, how are you noticing what's going on around you. So the people that walk into a room and it's almost as if they don't even know there are other people in there, and then there are other people that walk in and they are tapped in, they're making eye contact, they're present, that they are seeing you and hearing you.
Mm.
Right. So that's kind of the social awareness part of it. And that's really important for anybody, I mean, leaders or anybody else, to be able to kind of know what's going on with the people around them. So that you can move to social regulation, which is leaving a situation better than you found it, or trying to make the most out of your team, trying to, just make things very positive, and also help other people not get triggered, or at least get back into the blue if they are triggered, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So so and one thing I want to do is I want to go through, before we wrap up today, I want to go through each one of these 5. And I would love for you to give, like, almost like you did there, just a quick example of, like, reading the room,
Mhm.
and like, what's something universal that would be like a tip. So, like, when you go in the room, dot, dot, dot. And so I'd love to,
Mhm.
to take us there. But before I do that, sometimes when we change our behavior and we're thinking about, so for example, like, a lot of my clients use DISC, and so DISC is about, okay, I know myself, and I understand, I'm taking in data, and I'm trying to assess, like, which box do you fit in, and then I'm going to alter my behavior. And it strikes me that EQ work is also altering your behavior, of course. Can I still be authentic and be mindful of showing up differently?
Absolutely. Yes. You absolutely, and I think a lot of this is really learning to be authentic and tapping into who you truly are, and figuring out, where do you need to focus your work? Where do I need to grow? What do I need to, focus on? Because if you're trying to grow your EQ skills, you have to dig deep. and you have to figure out who you are and where you're coming from.
Mhm.
So yes, you can absolutely be authentic, and some people, it comes more naturally to some people than others, but yeah, that's the goal, is to figure out who you really are, and how can you bring your best self to work and to life.
And so it sounds like it's maybe even a little bit of deletion, like these insecurities and these things that we're afraid of. It's really maybe EQ is more about chipping those away so we can show up maybe more authentic. Is that fair?
That's fair. That's fair. And I hear a lot of times people will say, but that's not me. I can't do that. And then when we work a little, we drill down a little bit deeper, 3 months later, this is amazing. I didn't realize, yeah, this is was in me, but I didn't tap into it. I didn't know. Are there people who get there? Yes. But most of the reason is because they aren't as open to it. And yeah, maybe there's some things obviously that are more nature based and hard to change. But you can absolutely grow your EQ and be authentic.
So, where could I so how do I know if I have high EQ or low EQ? Is there some sort of assessment or a test that I can take?
Yes, and that's how I got into all of this, is doing these assessments, doing assessment reviews. So through the Oval Group is a great group that offers these assessments for figuring out what your EQ looks like, and so yes, there we do EQ assessments through TTI, but there are a lot of different groups that do them. So anybody who's interested in taking an EQ assessment, definitely reach out to me, and I can help you with that. And it's such a great thing to do, because then you know where you're starting from, and then you can move from there.
So, and by the way, I can vouch for the Oval Group if you're local. Well, even if you're not local, I mean, they work with people across the
Uh,
country.
all over the world.
Yeah. So, Dobby and Steve, I'll put some stuff in the show notes where you can reach out to them because they do amazing work on, increasing performance in the business setting. Okay, so let's go to, all right, so self-awareness. So talk to me about, and some of this you've said, but maybe a quick little sentence or two on what is self-awareness. Go across each of the five domains, and what is it, and then what's a practical tip that someone listening to this are like, oh, that's me. You know what? I think maybe I could improve there. What's a practical tip that might be useful in each one?
So for self-awareness and self-regulation, I would say really try to notice when you're triggered by tapping into those physical sensations that we talked about, and then regulate immediately. So for self-awareness, it's being aware of being triggered. For self-regulation, it's knowing, just taking action. And like I had mentioned, the breathing or self-talk, just knowing that you need to regulate will help. So that's what you would do for those two. We didn't really talk about motivation, but that motivation with EQ is internal fire. It's that internal desire to do something, regardless of external motivating factors like a raise or promotion or accolades from your boss. So it's just doing it because it's the right thing to do. And if you personally have lower internal motivation, that's more of a nature thing. There are things you can do to improve that, but it's just being aware that you might have to just push yourself a little bit more, right? If you have high internal motivation, it's knowing that you could be a perfectionist, and you maybe need to be aware of that and tamper that back. And we have a lot of tools, for that as well. And also, the last thing about motivation is knowing people may not be on the same motivation scale as you. So if you're highly motivated and somebody else has low motivation, doesn't mean they're lazy. It just means you might have to figure out more of an external motivator for them. So it's having a little bit of grace and having a little bit of patience with other people. That's how I would suggest looking at that motivation. And then moving into social awareness, as I said before, it's reading the room. So to just increase your social awareness today, when you go in to when you're with somebody else or a group of people, practice making eye contact, practice really listening, and practice being in the moment. And that will increase your social awareness just by doing that, those things. And then the final dimension, we have social regulation. And that is working with people to help them regulate or de-escalate if they're triggered, to stay regulated, to really, as I said, leave a situation better than you found it, but to also model behavior. So to also model the behavior that you want to see in your staff, your family, whoever it is. And I'll give one example that usually resonates with a lot of people. Think about being on an airplane. And if you're sitting there enjoying your coffee and the flight attendant's walking up and down, all of a sudden you feel turbulent and you get really nervous. What's the first thing we do? We look at the flight attendant. If the flight attendant's just making jokes and walking up and down the aisle, they're modeling calm behavior. They could be freaking out inside, but they're modeling calm behavior. Your amygdala is going to be like, no danger, all good, right? Fine. If, on the other hand, they start sweating and running up and down and talking to the pilot, your amygdala is going to say, we are in big time danger, right? So it's modeling the behavior to keep people calm, but also to elicit the behavior that you want them to have, if that makes sense.
That's great. That's really good. Thank you for sharing that. It reminds me, you said something earlier that sort of connects to that. And it is, I see this a lot in the work that I do. Sometimes leaders, when they're coaching people on their team, they want to be they want to be a no nonsense leader, and they want to, drive their team, and maybe they're a little overly emotional in some of these conversations, and they actually do more damage than good. And it's almost, you said something earlier about leaving the situation, leaving a person better after you leave the conversation. And I think sometimes leaders don't appreciate the fact that how a person's self-worth and their confidence and their ability, how it affects everything else that they do. So if we beat people up on their identity, you're always late, you never have the right solutions, if we beat people up and yet expect them to perform better, like those two don't go together. And so I think there's an art to coaching people. And I think there's I haven't thought about this before, but there's a huge emotional intelligence component to it, where you coach the roles, you coach the tasks, you coach what people are doing, but you do it without destroying the person's identity or their self-worth. And I think I see a lot of people miss that. Would you agree with that, or would you add anything to that?
I see that every day in my coaching. I just see when I hear an employee or staff member telling me, these horrible things that their manager has said to them or how they've made them feel. Yeah, I think we're missing the boat a lot of times in how we can get the best out of our employees. We're kind of going about it the wrong way a lot of times. And yeah, why not try to pull out the positive and really work on that? Like, what does this person bring to the table? Let's really work on that, as opposed to always beating that person down.
Yeah, I want to ask you one last question related to that, and then we'll start to wrap up. But in that vein, what about, how can I use some of the principles of emotional intelligence to have a difficult conversation? So being a leader, of course, requires that we have some tough conversations sometimes, and we don't want to beat people up. I think about, there's an old basketball coach years ago named John Wooden. And John Wooden was an amazing coach. He won, 11 national championships in 12 or 13 years. And he was this sort of grandfatherly type, all this, wisdom from the ages. And he used to say, when I have a tough conversation, I just give them a sandwich. I tell them something good. I tell them the truth, and then I tell them something good. So are there any tips you would have about how can we bring some of these concepts in when we're having difficult conversations with our team members?
Yes, I think the most important thing to remember is that these are human beings. These are people with feelings, with emotions. And so treat people with respect. No matter what they've done, they're still human, right? And yes, you may have to have difficult conversations. You might have to let somebody go. You might have to reprimand them. But I think it's really important for leaders to have patience, to really be patient and try to figure out what's going on, in the situation. Why did the person do what they did? To to just, again, be in the moment and be very present and really listen to, when you're having a conversation, a difficult conversation, listen to what the person's saying, and then take a pause before you respond and make sure, is what I'm saying helpful and beneficial, or is it just emotive? So I
Mm,
think that's the most important thing. Is it helpful and beneficial? Are they going to hear it because I'm saying it in a positive way? Or am I just emoting and just letting the anger and the frustration out?
that's good. That's good. So you've mentioned it in passing, but where can folks find you? Tell us a little bit about the work you do. If folks hear this and they'd like to have a conversation, they think maybe this might be something they can use with their teams and their organization. How can folks find you, and talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So I right now my main thing is coaching, so business and wellness coaching, and I do that on my own, but I partner with the Oval Group in working on helping executives and owners make their make people smarter, make smarter decisions, and using these assessment tools. So if anybody's interested in figuring out what their EQ looks like, then through myself and the Oval Group together, we can help you do that. Um, and then usually from that point, that's where I will take it a step further and really work with people, whether they're trying to improve their individual EQ or just their individual who they are, um, or figuring out who they are, or whether it's, a business who wants their team to grow and to become more EQ savvy, EQ aware. That's kind of my focus right now. So if you are interested in learning more, then you can go to my website, which is be-restored.com, or to the Oval Group website. And I know you'll put that in the show notes.
Yep.
So reach out to either of us, and we would, really be happy to work with you.
Yeah, and one last thing before we say goodbye is, it strikes me that this would be a great phone call to make if you are in an organization and you've got this really talented employee who was a rock star when they were an individual contributor, and they were so amazing that you tapped them on the shoulder and said, "You're the new vice president." And as in a leadership role, you're failing. And there are a lot of these people out there, particularly in corporate settings, where they just don't have the skill set to be a manager and a leader. And their teams are in disarray. Frankly, you find very talented people who can sometimes turn into tyrants, like really hard to deal with. They suck the life out of their team. There's lots of turnover, but they're a good person. They've got everything, and it might just be that one dial of just they don't understand. They don't have the self-awareness to regulate themselves, and they don't realize how they come across to other people. And in my corporate days, every organization I ever worked with, there was at least one of those people. And hopefully it was never me, but you observe that. And that's a really good way we don't want to lose these people. They bring so much institutional knowledge and they're good at what they do, but they're just missing that one component. And I think as I've listened to you talk today, Kim, I think I think sometimes that is the thing that keeps people from reaching the levels that they could very well reach with just a little bit of coaching and a little bit of self-awareness. So anyway, I'm glad that you were able to join us. Anything you want to share with the audience before we leave? Did we miss anything, or is there something we haven't talked about that you want to share?
I think we just covered the surface. You could go on for days with emotional intelligence. There's so much more to it. Hopefully, this gives everybody an overview. And in response to what you just said, the beauty and my awe of the Oval Group is that that's exactly what they do. I have seen the Oval Group, and I've been a part of some of it, turn businesses around, turn people around. And like you said, the most amazing thing is to watch a person who was an incredible employee get promoted or get shifted, go down the rabbit hole, and then come back up better than ever before. And so that's the beauty of not just EQ, but all of these assessment tools that we talked about too, like DISC and some of the other ones as well. So yeah, I hope this gives a good overview, but there is a lot more to learn. So
Well,
lots of resources out there.
certainly a lot for people to think about. And again, thank you for coming on. This is exactly the kinds of topics that I love to delve into. So there'll be lots of information in the show notes. And again, Kim, thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much, Robin, for having me.